Good evening to you, wherever you may be. I'm very grateful to have been re-invited by Slavyanka to be with you once again for another exploration of a little-known area of the great body of sacred choral music that has been produced within the Russian Orthodox Church. And I guarantee you that tonight you are in for a real treat, because the repertoire we will be presenting is truly unexplored. And this despite the fact that in recent years, there has been not only increased interest in Orthodox sacred music, as evidenced by concerts, recordings, and Grammy nominations, but also in the Orthodox Christian faith itself, which is no longer something that is solely the domain of émigrés from Russia, Greece, the Balkans, and the Middle East, but is increasingly attracting large numbers of American inquirers and converts. They are drawn by the historic authenticity and doctrinal continuity of the Orthodox Church, which goes back to apostolic times, by the depth of the theology and spirituality, and not the least, by the beauty and splendor of Orthodox liturgical worship, which includes sacred singing unaccompanied by any musical instruments. The first 2 decades of the 20th century witnessed the rise of a tremendous flowering of new composition for the Church of Russia, a new direction, as it was called, which saw a rediscovery of the Orthodox Church's age-old chant traditions, a rejection of the secular vocabulary of the Western European and classical styles that had infiltrated church music in the 18th and 19th centuries, and an earnest search for a musical style that would be spiritually edifying, driven by the sacred liturgical text, and as distinct from the secular music of the day as the richly gilded vestments of the clergy were from the dress of the laity. And here we have an image of Orthodox clergy in their vestments. There is no question that these individuals are dressed for a very special purpose and a special occasion, and there would be no mistaking of them for an ordinary person in the street. Well, during this period, in the early 20th century, dozens of Russian composers turned to writing sacred music on Orthodox texts, producing hundreds of new works, including such well-known masterworks as Sergei Rachmaninoff's Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which premiered in 1910, his All-Night Vigil, which premiered in 1915, Alexander Grechaninov's Passion Week and All-Night Vigil, both of which premiered in 1912, and Alexander Kostalsky's Memory Eternal to the Fallen Heroes, a one-of-a-kind requiem specifically devoted to the Allied soldiers who perished during World War I, which premiered in 1917. Other prominent names who were actively composing at this time included Pavel Chesnakov and his brother Alexander, Mikhail Ippolitov-Ivanov, Konstantin Shvedov, Viktor Kalinnikov, and Nikolai Cherepnin, among many others. The mighty outpouring of musical creativity was brought to an abrupt end by the 2 revolutions that occurred in Russia in 1917. Almost immediately after taking over the reins of power in October of 1917, the Bolshevik communists, who were in every respect a vile and evil group of men that was thoroughly alien to Russian national, cultural, and religious traditions and values, declared an all-out war against the Russian Orthodox Church and its cultural and humanitarian organizations. Church institutions were immediately defunded, to use a term that has recently gained prominence. They were defunded. Church property was seized and destroyed. Clergy, monastics, and Orthodox laity were subject to arrest and humiliating show trials, and often executed by firing squad, even without the benefit of a trial. And here we see some photos of the destruction of Russian churches, the destruction of Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow, and other churches that were either destroyed entirely or were left in this semi-ruined state for everyone to see. There's a brigade of communists posing in front of the work of their hands. Bells were unmounted from bell towers and smashed to pieces. And during World War II, a great number of them were simply melted down for ammunition. Well, church musicians, choir directors, and composers who had relied on the church for a livelihood found themselves unable to work, or were given the stark choice of severing all their ties with the church as a condition for continuing their secular employment as conservatory professors or concert performers. By 1921, all public performances of sacred music were expressly forbidden by the communist commissars in power. And so it began one of the greatest forced emigrations of any nation's people that the world had ever seen up to that point in time. Scores of intellectuals, university professors, philosophers, and creative artists were either forcibly deported or were blacklisted from any employment and thus forced to seek employment abroad. Among the musical emigres were such prominent names as Sergei Rachmaninov, Alexander Glazunov, Alexander Grechaninov, Nikolai Cherepnin, Konstantin Shvedov, Alexander Chesnakov, Andrei Ilyashenko, and Alexander Arkhangelsky. They were the first wave, so to speak, men who had already established a reputation as composers of sacred choral music in Russia, and who now found it untenable to remain in their homeland. Their respective fates were varied. Some, like Rachmaninov, never wrote another note of sacred choral music while living abroad. Others, like Grechaninov, were quite enterprising and continued to compose both works for the Orthodox tradition and works such as masses and motets in Latin, intended for Roman Catholic use, and other Orthodox and other choral works, some of them actual adaptations of Orthodox works that were presented in English for use in Protestant services. A second group of Russian emigre composers were those of a somewhat younger generation whose compositional talents were revealed already in the emigration. These include men such as the Kedrovs, father and son, Maxim Kovalevsky, Ivan Gardner, Alfred Swan, Boris Litkovsky, and Mikhail Konstantinov. Finally, a third category of composers who may be regarded as creative offspring of the Russian immigration are those who were born abroad to Orthodox immigrant parents, or in some cases, converts to the Orthodox faith, whose compositional output has been strongly influenced by Russian Orthodox choral music. They represent the living legacy, so to speak, of those who came before them. Tonight, we will introduce you to some musical examples from all three of those groups. But before speaking about the composers and their works, we need to say a few words about the significance of the Orthodox Church and the heritage of liturgical singing among the Russian diaspora as a whole. A historian of the Russian immigration, Pierre Kovalevsky, writes in his two-volume history entitled Russia Abroad, and I quote, "Russian choral singing, no less than other branches of art, and perhaps even more, has had an influence all over the world and continues to project itself in the most unexpected circles in the West." Now, he wrote this in the early 1970s, and from the context, it's obvious that the author is speaking primarily about sacred music, but as we can see, it's even more true today, 50 years later. So why was Russian church singing so vital to the culture of Russian immigration? The fact of the matter is that life in the Russian diaspora finally witnessed the joining of two streams or two threads, which previously had existed in parallel but rarely intersecting threads, coming together only at the beginning of the 20th century. The first of these was Orthodox tradition in a broad sense, and the second was the modern day quest for the spiritual, which is to this day all around us. The first thread, the gravitation towards Orthodox tradition, derived from the need felt by people of various social classes, ranks, and ages who had lost their native land and had experienced severe personal trials. They had a need to find a small piece of homeland somewhere. And for many of them, this land of their own became the Orthodox Church. Whereas before the Russian Revolution, there was only one Orthodox church in Paris, the so-called Embassy Church of St. Alexander Nevsky, and throughout all of France, there were only 5 other parishes, primarily in resort towns. And with a similar number in Germany, even fewer in Italy, Switzerland, England. By 1937, there were about 6 dozen Russian churches in France alone. 6 dozen. Naturally, all of them had choirs, and there, the local French, or whatever country they happened to be in, the Germans, the Swiss, the English, would often visit these churches, and which were for the most part humble and situated in sometimes in random spaces, converted houses and things like that. But they were attracted, these foreign visitors, they were attracted by the beauty of the services and the singing. The second thread was the early 20th century Russian Orthodox religious revival, which continued in the immigration. The religious historian Nikolai Zirnov writes the following, I quote, "The Russian religious revival began too late to affect the Russian intelligentsia in a timely fashion, but it enriched world culture. This was achieved thanks to the Russian emigration, which included prominent representatives of religious and philosophical thought. These individuals were able to present convincingly the traditions of the Orthodox faith in the language and concepts of modern culture, and thus they preserved abroad a sense of historical continuity for Russia at a time when it was being systematically destroyed in its homeland, end quote. And here we just want to mention, for those in our audience who may be interested, a few names of these prominent thinkers, theologians, philosophers, and writers. Men like Nikolai Berdyaev, Nikolai Losky, his son Vladimir Losky, and Sergius Bulgakov, George Florovsky, Alexander Schmemann, and John Meyendorff, the latter four of them being Orthodox priests, along with other religious figures such as Metropolitan Anthony Bloom of London, Saint Silouan of Mount Athos, Saint Sophrony Sakharov, and Mother Maria Skoptsova. These all were spokespersons, the spokespersons and the vehicles through which Orthodoxy became known in the West and elsewhere throughout the world. But returning to the music, in 2003, Father Peter Perekrestov, who is the senior priest at the Russian Orthodox Cathedral of the Mother of God, Joy of All Who Sorrow in San Francisco, those of you who are from San Francisco Bay Area definitely know this cathedral on Geary Boulevard. Well, Father Peter initiated a remarkable series of recordings entitled Chants of the Russian Emigres. Gathering the sheet music here in the West, he contracted with some of the leading choirs in Russia to record these works, most of which were world premiere recordings. The last disc in the series, volume 11, was released in 2018, and altogether the series contains over 250 titles by more than 20 different composers. These discs are available, incidentally, as downloads from musicarusica.com. I only mention that because the actual pressings of the CDs have long been sold out. They were selling in Russia as well as here. And you won't find most of these albums on Spotify or Pandora, but you can download them from Musica Rusica. I'd like to play for you a track from volume 5 in the series, a composition by Mikhail Konstantinov. Here he is, who is a Russian emigre composer with very close ties to San Francisco. After a promising career as an operatic tenor in Kiev during the 1920s and 30s, he and his family fled to Romania during World War II. And just as an example of the hardships and ordeals that refugees experienced, during a bombardment, a fire destroyed the train that was carrying Konstantinov's entire church music library, which he took with him, even in those days of panic and confusion. And his story is by no means unique. Other people as well lost everything during the process of fleeing their homeland simply to preserve their lives. Settling in San Francisco in the early 1950s, he became chief choir master at the Joy of All Who Sorrow Cathedral, a post that he held until 1980 when he suffered a stroke and departed this life in 1982. A great many of his compositions and chant arrangements were written for the cathedral choir, and one of them you will hear now, Go Up to Mount Zion, which is sung by as the bishop ascends the cathedra, the raised platform in the center of the church prior to the start of a hierarchical divine liturgy. This richly scored piece is reminiscent of the new direction of the early 20th century, and it's sung here by the domestic Municipal Choir of Yekaterinburg, one of the finest Russian professional choirs under the direction of the late Valery Kopanyov. On January 29th, 2018, the Moscow Conservatory hosted an extraordinary concert that was devoted and designed to commemorate all church musicians, composers, choir masters, and singers who had suffered over the past 100 years as a result of the Communist Revolution. They were harassed, exiled to the Gulag, in some cases executed, or forced to flee their homeland. And as many names as could be remembered by name were remembered at a solemn memorial service the day before at the Church of St. Clement in Moscow. Then on the evening of the 29th of January, a standing room only audience filled the conservatory's Rachmaninoff Hall, which had been once the chief performing venue for the Moscow Synodal Choir before 1918, when the Bolsheviks disbanded the choir and closed the affiliated Synodal Choir School. Within there's, by the way, a slide of the Synodal School. This is on Bolshaya Nikitinskaya Ulitsa. So if you go to your right of your screen, the next set of buildings is the Moscow Conservatory. It's right next door. And now the hall has been turned over to the conservatory. And here you see a photograph of the Moscow Synodal Choir taken inside the hall in those robes that they performed in when they sang in church at the Uspensky Cathedral in the Kremlin. And inside this hall, as I mentioned, a lot of the great Russian choral works that were associated with a new direction in the early 20th century saw their premieres. Well, on the occasion of the concert at the Moscow Conservatory, all the works that were in the program were created in the Russian diaspora. The first half featured excerpts from Konstantin Shvedov's Liturgy for Men's Chorus, Opus 40, which had been composed in 1935 for the famous Don Cossack Choir, but for a series of circumstances was never premiered at the time. There we have a photograph of Shvedov. He was a very promising young graduate of the Moscow Synodal School, who in 1922 went on tour in the West and never returned. In essence, he was an early defector. In the early 1990s, the manuscript of his unpublished liturgy came to the attention of Alexei Shapovalnikov, who at the time was the conductor of Slavyanka. And they, Slavyanka, made the world premiere recording of this work, from which we will now hear an excerpt. Perhaps many of you in the audience were singers on that recording. It was this very same manuscript that served as the basis for the score that was performed in 2018 at the commemorative concert in Moscow. So here is now Slavyanka performing "Come Let Us Worship" from the liturgy. This work shows Shvedov to be a worthy perpetuator of the Moscow synodal style within which he was nurtured. And one can only wonder what other great works he might have composed if he had had the opportunity to write for a top-level choir, such as the Moscow Synodal Choir. The second half of the concert in Moscow on January 29th, 2018, featured the Kostalsky Chamber Choir, whose artistic director is Alexei Rudnevsky, professor of the Moscow Conservatory. On this occasion, it was augmented by women's voices in a program of works by an illustrious lineup of Russian emigre composers. We will share with you several highlights from that concert. The first work I'd like to present is by Alexander Chesnokov, brother of the more famous and prolific composer Pavel Chesnokov. He was a graduate of both the Moscow Synodal School of Church Singing and the St. Petersburg Conservatory. And he was considered by his teachers to be an even more gifted composer than his brother. Upon graduating from the St. Petersburg Conservatory, he became a professor there and was simultaneously appointed an assistant conductor of the Imperial Chapel Choir. But in 1921, he was summarily dismissed from both posts and blacklisted from finding any musical work. In 1925, he went abroad in search of work, leaving behind his wife and two daughters. His sojourn abroad was to have been temporary, but he never saw his family again. After working a series of menial musical jobs, he eventually came to the US, where he died. So now I'm going to try and perform a technical sleight of hand as I switch from my presentation of slides to YouTube, and hopefully everything will just be seamless. Chesnokov, just to say a few more words about him, left behind a small number of works, some of which were published in France and some of which remained in unpublished manuscript. One of these works is from the all-night vigil he was in the process of composing but never completed. These are the resurrectional troparia, Blessed art thou, O Lord, Благословен еси Господи. And here you will see the Kostalsky Chamber Choir under the direction of guest conductor, Dr. Peter Yermachov, who is himself the son of Russian emigres and who has built a distinguished career as a conductor and educator here in the US and elsewhere. I think you'll agree that those of us who are familiar with works like the Rachmaninoff All-Night Vigil, you'll see that here we have someone who is in the same ballpark, in the same caliber as a composer, but we only have these unfinished fragments of hints of something in an all-night vigil of his. Well, another composer who also began work on an all-night vigil but didn't complete it was Nikolai Cherepnin, whom you see here. He was a favorite student of Rimsky-Korsakov, and he published a number of liturgical works before the revolution, also holding prestigious posts as conductor at the Mariinsky Theater and conductor of Serge Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. In 1918, fleeing the revolutionary turmoil in St. Petersburg, he moved with his family to Georgia, becoming director of the Tbilisi Conservatory. But in 1921, when the Bolsheviks took over Georgia, he fled again, this time to France. There's an interesting story about how Cherepnin saw the writing on the wall. He was in the middle of an orchestra rehearsal trying to correct a passage in the French horn section that showed no improvement after 3 or 4 repetitions. And so Cherepnin turned to the orchestra and said, "Gentlemen, we will have to keep at it until we get it right." And at this point, a young player leaped to his feet and jeered, "The gentlemen have all run off to Batumi. Here, we're all comrades." Well, at that, Cherepnin was shocked and angered and left the theater, and shortly after that managed to arrange for his family's emigration to France. 6 movements of Cherepnin's Vespers, which is the first part of the all-night vigil, were published in Paris in 1925. And they called for choral forces very similar to Rachmaninoff's all-night vigil, which had been written 10 years earlier. But by then, there was no choir in the Russian émigré circles that could perform such complex music and do justice to it. So the work lay silent until the 1990s. Several movements of it were included in various volumes of the Chants of the Russian Émigré series, and all 6 movements saw their Moscow premiere at the concert on January 29th under Peter Yermakov's direction. Shortly thereafter, there's a double image again. Shortly thereafter, Peter directed this album of works to the Mother of God, Blessed Art Thou Among Women. So we will listen now to Bogorodice Devo, Rejoice, O Virgin, from this album by the mixed choir of the Patram, Russian American Musical Institute, from Cherepnin's All-Night Vigil. Another composer who would have undoubtedly made a significant mark upon Russian Orthodox sacred choral literature had his life turned out differently was Andrei Ilyashenko. Ilyashenko was another student of Rimsky-Korsakov. Well, rather, he was in the hierarchy of students of Rimsky-Korsakov. In this case, he was a student of Rimsky-Korsakov's son-in-law and successor at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, Maximilian Steinberg, whose own remarkable Passion Week based on early Russian chants has only come to light within the last decade. Ilyashenko left Russia during the Civil War of 1918 to 1922 and eventually settled in Brussels, Belgium, where he lived and taught in relative obscurity. Several of his later sacred works were published and recorded in the Chants of the Russian Emigre series, and one of them, from an unpublished manuscript, found its way onto the Grammy-winning album, The Sacred Spirit of Russia, here, recorded released in 2014 by one of the finest professional choirs in the US, Conspirare, under the direction of Craig Hella-Johnson. So listen now to this magnificently rich Christmas hymn, We Should Learn to Love Silence, by Andrei Ilyashenko. Well, the sacred music of the Russian emigres has also found a home in churches whose native tongue, as it were, is not Church Slavonic. A vivid example of this cross-cultural adaptation can be found in the works and legacy of Maxim Kovalevsky. Kovalevsky was born in Russia, but left his homeland as a teenager, eventually coming to live in France. While expressing a keen interest in the study of Russian chants and composing numerous choral arrangements of them, he, along with his brother Yevgraf, became leaders of the French Orthodox Church, a group that sought to restore the ancient pre-schism Gallican rite of the one universal church in the West. Kovalevsky drew upon melodies of Gregorian chant adapted to the French language, arranging them using the harmonies he learned from his experience with Slavic chant. Indeed, a very interesting cross-fertilization. So we were about to listen to We Praise Thee by Maxim Kovalevsky, sung in English. Can you hear that?
Badly. Not really, Vlad. There's something wrong with the, it's not coming through.
I can hear you loud and clear.
We can hear you personally, but we can't hear the music.
Okay, all right, let me try that again. All right, that might do it.
Now we can hear it. It's good.
What we were saying before is that the legacy of the Russian emigres has resonated beyond those original composers who came from Russia. And it has inspired and informed composers who were born outside of Russia and who in several cases are converts to the Orthodox faith, having no ethnic Russian roots whatsoever. The father of Archpriest Sergei Glogolev was born in Russia from a long line of Orthodox clergy and came to the US in 1925 as a musician in a circus band. His son, Sergei, was born in 1928 in Gary, Indiana, and studied music at Oberlin College Conservatory and New York University before enrolling at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. As his pastoral ministry developed, Father Sergei was sent to California in the 1950s to establish one of the first English-only parishes in what was then known as the American Metropolia of the Russian Orthodox Church, that church that was brought to Alaska initially by the Russian monks in 1794. Thoroughly versed in the style of Russian sacred music, in his student days, he had met the composer Gretchaninov, who had settled in the United States after World War II. Sergei Glagoliev found himself composing Orthodox liturgical music, but using English as the first language. This process led to markedly different results than taking works originally composed in Church Slavonic and adapting them into English, as we heard in the previous example. During his nearly 70 years as a priest and church musician, Father Sergei Glagoliev proved to be enormously influential in Orthodox sacred choral music circles in America, and one of his works was fittingly included in the Moscow concert of January 29, 2018. Father Sergei was laid to rest at St. Tikhon's Monastery not quite 2 weeks ago, following a divine liturgy that was comprised almost entirely from his own compositions. So listen once again to the Kostaysky Chamber Choir, directed by Peter Yermakhov, performing Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silent, a hymn from the Liturgy of Great and Holy Saturday in the Orthodox tradition, which text likely dates back to the 3rd century AD. And I'm sorry to have cut that off in the interest of time, but just gives you a little bit of a taste of the works of this wonderful composer, this first American Orthodox composer in the Russian style. Now, we could devote an entire program to the works of composers who are converts to Orthodoxy and whose musical output has been shaped and inspired by the Russian school. One such composer, Kurt Sander, is a professor of composition at Northern Kentucky University and has composed numerous works, both in Church Slavonic and in English, including a complete setting of the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom in 2018 in the English language. The recording of this liturgy by the Patram Institute Singers, directed by Peter Yermachov, was nominated for a Grammy in the category Best Choral Performance for 2019. And in 2019, in an interesting twist of events, a performance of Sander's liturgy translated into Church Slavonic was premiered in that very same Rachmaninoff Hall of the Moscow Conservatory. So I want to play you just a little brief excerpt from Kurt Sander's. There's the cover of the published score and the recording. This is from this is American Orthodox music, but it would have scarcely been written this way without the influence.
Remember thy congregation which thou hast purchased from the beginning. But God is our King before the ages. He hath wrought salvation in the midst of the earth.
So again, as I was saying there before the music rudely interrupted me, this is music that is American Orthodox, but it would have scarcely been written quite in this fashion without the influence of the Russian school. Another up-and-coming composer whose family converted to Orthodoxy when he was 13 years old is Benedict Sheehan, who is currently the director of music at St. Tikhon's Seminary and Monastery in Pennsylvania. Just recently, in 2020, he also published and recorded a complete liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, for which he received second place in the American Prize for Composition in the choral division, and the recording of which by St. Tikhon's Choir may well be a Grammy contender next year. While it uses actual pre-existing Orthodox chants in only a limited fashion, its sound is so congruent with Orthodox tradition that portions of his liturgy have also been translated into Slavonic and sung in Russia. In the words of the eminent Russian conductor and choir master Vladimir Gorbik, I quote, "Benedict Sheehan's church music is more Orthodox than anything currently being composed in Russia." Let's listen to a little example from his liturgy. Again, in the interest of time, we have to cut that short, but it's music of surpassing beauty. The British composer, Archpriest Ivan Moody, came to the Orthodox faith in London, singing in the London Cathedral Choir under Father Michael Fortunato, and listening to the sermons of Metropolitan Anthony Bloom. In his works, he draws freely upon both Russian and Greek Byzantine chants, including this work, All of Creation Rejoices in You, O Full of Grace, which is in Church Slavonic and prominently features a pre-existing Russian chant melody, but sung over a Greek-style drone or ison. Let's listen to a portion of that. That was Capella Romana under the direction of Alexander Lingis, one of our West Coast groups here, headquartered in Portland. As the preceding four examples have shown, even though the events that led to the Russian emigration occurred over 100 years ago, the legacy left behind by those courageous and long-suffering composers is still very much alive and bearing new fruits. As we close our evening survey of the music of and inspired by Russian immigrant composers, we want to end with two works. The first of these is perhaps the most widely known and recognizable of all works composed by a Russian emigre, the Lord's Prayer, or Otche Nash, by Nikolai Kedrov Sr. Kedrov began his career as an operatic baritone in St. Petersburg, and then in 1897, he established the famous St. Petersburg Vocal Quartet, with which he toured successfully in Russia and Western Europe. And sometime in 1922, he and his family emigrated, first to Germany and then to France, where he reconstituted the quartet and toured in Europe and the United States. It was also in 1922 that he composed his famous Lord's Prayer. This was the encore number in the Moscow concert of January 29th, 2018. And as you look into the hall behind the conductor, you will see how gradually the entire audience stands and silently joins the singers in a spirit of prayerful reverence. As the final composer in our survey tonight, we highlight the contributions of Boris Mikhailovich Litkovsky, who, as a young man, studied at the Moscow Conservatory in the years just prior to the revolution. Then, joining the ranks of the White Army in 1918, in 1920, he evacuated with them first to Turkey, then to Bulgaria. Between the wars, he directed various choirs, both in churches and on the concert stage. And in 1951, like so many of his compatriots, he moved from war-torn Europe to the United States. Lietkovsky's name and legacy are closely connected with the church singing practices of the two largest Slavic Orthodox jurisdictions in North America, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, also known as ROKOR, and the Orthodox Church in America, the OCA. From 1952 to his death in 1975, Lietkovsky served as choir master at the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Sign in New York, and at the same time taught church singing at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, making several recordings with both of these choirs. Consequently, Lietkovsky's works are widely performed in American Orthodox churches, and in recent years, they are often sung in Russia as well. Listen now to the closing work from the concert honoring those church musicians who suffered as a result of the communists in Russia. It's a festive concerto-style setting of the most famous and triumphant hymn in the entire Orthodox Church experience, the Troparion of Pascha. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Somehow I can't help but think of the associations with the Hallelujah chorus there, you know, the Russian equivalent of Handel's masterpiece. These exuberant bell-ringing motifs of this Christ is risen, which concludes our program tonight, as well as that concert in Moscow, they proclaim the victory of life over death, of light over darkness, and stand as a symbol of faith and hope, all those things that supported both the Russian composers of the Russian emigration and the vast numbers of Russian people who found themselves displaced from their homeland by historical circumstances. And they bring to mind St. Paul's words from the epistle of to the Corinthians: unknown, yet well known, dying, and behold, we live, chastened, and yet not killed, sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, poor, yet making many rich, having nothing, and yet possessing all things. So I thank you for your attention tonight. I hope you discovered some new things that you didn't know before, and that this beautiful music brought some joy and light and hope into your life as well this evening. I see that we're kind of at the time of end of our stated length of time, but I'm certainly willing to field some questions if there are any questions. And I'll turn the floor back over to you, Paul, and thank you again for this opportunity.
Oh, Vlad, thank you. I'm sure I speak for many others on this call, saying that you've opened up a whole part of this musical world and this sacred music legacy that we didn't know before. So thank you very much for that. And not just, I think, for many of us who grew up, really feeling essentially that this Russian music is a historical, who understood it historically. I mean, it's wonderful to have this increased sense of it being a living tradition that extends well into the modern era, right up to the time that we live in now. I think many of us, that's a wonderful thing. I can't help also by saying that watching all these choruses makes us ache for the time that we too can be singing again as ensembles. And of course, it brings back memories for many of us of singing in exactly this Rachmaninoff Hall in our 2016 tour in Moscow with the conservatory. Thank you, and let's open it up for questions. I go full screen here. Let's see if we can do that here. Let's see, let's see. Vlad, you need to stop sharing your screen. I think that will help.
Okay.
And then and I think we can open up let's see, we'll go full screen with everybody here. Good, okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's open it up to questions, comments, etc. Just wonderful to see all these faces here. So.
Questions? You all need to
yes, somebody needs to unmute if you're asking a question.
I do have a question.
Let's.
Only heard one female composer's name mentioned in the inspired by the Russian Orthodox tradition. Is it just the one, or are there more?
There are not many known women composers of Russian Orthodox music, or for that matter, classical music either, secular classical music.
True.
Yet.
Yet.
But I'm saying, speaking historically. Of course, if you go back in the deeper history of the Orthodox Church, you find the nun Kassiani, who was highlighted just recently by a recording of her hymns by Capella Romana. She is known. She is the first known woman composer, the earliest woman composer of all time. She was an incredibly erudite and educated monastic in Constantinople around the time of the 9th century.
I have a quick comment to add to that. Irina and I were both judges for the Moscow Conservatory new young composers competition, which was an international competition this year. And the Kostalski competition is what it is called. And there were at least half or maybe more of the entries were female.
You're talking about in Moscow.
Yes, well, the entries came from all over.
Right.
The competition was sponsored by Moscow Conservatory.
Right, right. The sacred music.
Well, no, this was just a general competition, but there was a sacred music category.
I see.
Other questions, other thoughts?
Yes. Hello.
Please, Alex, yeah.
Yes, I hadn't heard of I believe it's Alexander Chesnokov. That's a new composer to me. I had heard of the other Chesnokov quite, he's very prominent in all of this music. I really enjoyed the composition that I was able to hear. It's unfortunate that there's not more work that we could hear from that composer. Maybe we could find some more eventually if we can look in the archives.
Or Musica Rusica.
Yeah, no, there is an archive. I think it was mentioned in the prefatory comments for this evening's lecture. There is an online resource called the Orthodox Sacred Music Reference Library, which I am the curator of it, and it's orthodoxchoral.org. And you can find there all the published works of Alexander Chesnokov, as well as Pavel Chesnokov, some 100 times, several hundred of those. But there were actually 4 Chesnokov brothers. And they were all musicians, but only Pavel and Alexander reached some kind of national and international renown.
Mm.
Yeah,
I just wanted to say that. Yeah.
Lots of music yet to be discovered, both written before the revolution and since the revolution. Yes, very rich.
Who else has a question? I think you've left us mostly speechless, Vlad.
I'm sorry.
No, it's just been wonderful. I just really want to say it's just been great. Tell us a little bit about how you personally got involved in all this, Vlad. I'd love to hear just, a little story about your own involvement and how it started for you. Why are you doing this?
Why am I doing this? At some point, I caught the choral bug when I was a senior in high school and then in college, singing at Occidental College with Howard Swan, one of the greatest collegiate choral conductors of our time. And then that was right at the same time that there was the first recording of there was a 3-record LP, vinyl LP set that came out from Russia, and it was only sold to foreign tourists through Biroska stores. If you remember what Biroska stores were, hard currency store. You bring your dollars and Deutschmarks and no rubles. And so on this recording that was made, it was a kind of a propaganda tool that was released to show that Russian choral sacred music isn't being persecuted in Russia, in the Soviet Union. Here it is for all to hear. And this caught my interest because I attended church, of course, in Los Angeles at Holy Virgin Mary Cathedral, and we had a very good choir. But they didn't sing any of that music that was on those 3 LPs. And so that piqued my interest. And I said, well, who is Kostalski? Who is Chesnokov? Who is Kalinnikov? I looked in the music encyclopedias, you couldn't find anything. I went to USC, I went to UCLA, to the largest libraries, nothing, you couldn't find their music. And so one thing that led after another. I got some wonderful travel opportunities from through the Watson Foundation and through the Fulbright Foundation. Traveled to the Soviet Union, where I was allowed to research sacred music that was otherwise forbidden for my counterparts, my young Russian scholarly counterparts, they couldn't study sacred music if they were interested in a career. So that's how this music collecting all started. And then, of course, I sang in Yevgeny Ivanovich Yevitz's choir in Paris at the St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral, which we mentioned, that embassy church that existed in Paris. It was a wonderful choir. It was a wonderful opportunity to get to know the repertoire kind of from the inside as a singer. And just one thing after another, and here we are.
I think people can find that music now.
Yes. Well, that's part of the reason for. I know how many people helped me. They shared their resources with me. I know how much effort it took me to get those, and there's no reason why some young up and coming choral musician in Novosibirsk or in Buenos Aires, anywhere in the world, why they should have to go through a lot of trouble to find that music. So now they go to orthodoxchoral.org and simply download that. We have like over 750 registered users in about a year that this resource has existed, and they're from all over the world, and they've downloaded something like 31,000 unique downloads so far. So the music is getting out there, and we can only hope that it's being well studied and well performed, and making the world a more beautiful place.
I'm also curious. We've talked a lot about, and you've given us a wonderful history here. I'm wondering what do you see ahead? What do you see over the horizon? What are the things that really excite your interest in terms of things that either you see coming as developments in this field, or things that you would love to see for this next generation to be doing? What are the challenges that you see?
Well, I think in this country we have some. I demonstrated some of the promising manifestations that we have for the future.
Yes.
With both the composers that I mentioned, Kurt Sander and Benedict Sheehan, they have students, they have young composers whom they are mentoring. And I think that we can look forward. I know that Benedict has composed a Vespers that he just recorded about a month ago, and that will be forthcoming. He's also working on another liturgy. Kurt Sander is also working on new compositions. As far as Russia is concerned, it's a little more difficult to answer that question. Of course, there are composers in Russia. Of course, they're writing, among other things, Orthodox sacred music. And just this past year, this is what whoever asked the question about or made the comment about the competition of young composers. There's the Moscow Patriarchate had its own, I don't think this was the same thing, it had its own competition of sacred music, not necessarily Orthodox. They had entries from the Catholic and the Protestant tradition, but Christian music. They had a first ever competition. And again, there were many worthwhile entries, and that's of course a promising thing. But we can't neglect, and we can't not notice the results of 75 years of communism, which ruptured the tradition. It created a major rift, and that's a wound that is still in the process of being healed, and will take some time, I think. But it's certainly not something that if we were talking 30 or 40 years ago that we could have anticipated at this point that we would be at the point where we are now with the Russian Orthodox Church kind of resurgent and rebuilding and restoring and opening new churches. If you look at the statistics, there's still a long way to go compared to the number of churches that existed in Russia before the revolution to the number now. But there is an upward trend, and I think we can be thankful for that.
Great. Well, any other, did I see another hand go there? Is that Bettina? Did you raise your hand?
That was me with fiddling with my glasses.
Okay.
I just want to say there's a young composer that I heard recently. The basso profundo Glenn Miller performed his solo piece. I think his name is Zelodkov.
Zheludkov, yes.
Zelodkov, yeah.
Sergei
Yes,
Zheludkov. He's definitely a name to watch.
Mhm.
He has written some wonderful music and continues to write. Yes.
Yes, that's a young guy that I think you should watch out for.
Yes. Sergei Zheludkov. You heard it here.
That's great. Okay, so Olga is asking, I wanted to watch it over again. Is there a chance to do that? Yes, there is. I should have mentioned that. I did actually mention at the beginning, it is recorded. Somebody else asked Vlad if there is a playlist of, could you send that? And I will be, if people, if you could just a playlist of what you sent, of what you played during the presentation, I will then, if you send me an email, paulandrews@earthlink.net, and Bettina, if you could put that in the chat, then people can send me an email, and I'd be happy to forward Vlad's list to you if you email me and let me know that you'd like it.
Yeah. So
I see.
All the recordings, of course, are in the slides. So as you're watching, if you watch the video over, you'll see it in the slides. But yes, I'll be
correct.
happy.
Yeah, that would be great. And maybe, and they're all available from Rusica. These various recordings are mostly available.
Well, the Chants of the Russian Emigres, that whole series, yes, it's available from us. Blessed Art Thou Among Women is available from Patram, patram.org, or from Reference Recordings, which is the record label. We don't carry CDs anymore at Musica Rusica simply because no one buys the physical little pieces of plastic anymore, and so people don't have equipment to play them on in many cases. So you can get downloads from the labels themselves online or listen to them on Spotify. But for example, yeah, some people still have CD players, but
thank you, Dax.
Yeah. Well, anyway, but yeah, I'll be happy to provide a playlist, and of course, many of the concert videos that I was showing, they're just on YouTube, and I'll send a list of the links, and there are other links of other works from that very same concert.
That's great. That's terrific.
Yeah.
Well, unless there's any other burning questions, I just want to say thank you again. This has just been wonderful and just really has just opened up our eyes and ears to a whole different world, Vlad. So thank you. Thank you again for the second time for doing that. So good.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Good.
Good night, everyone.
List in the chat, list of core works, so you can take a look there. And again, paulandrews@earthlink.net if you want to get the playlist. So thanks for coming, everyone. Wonderful to see you, all these wonderful faces, almost all of them familiar, so this is great. Yeah, let me just pause and say two things. One, Vlad, as probably many people on this call know, is the head of something called Musica Rusica, which is if you have a continuing interest in Russian music or how to find Russian sacred music recordings, that would be the place to go. And if you're doing that, don't hesitate to also go to Slavyanka's website and contribute what you can to, so we can continue to do this kind of evening. All right, good.
Thank you, Vlad.
Okay, good night.
Good night.